Thanks for joining me again on Suncoast In Depth. This is in particular a study, a class called Religion, the Human Quest to Reconnect. And we have been talking about Buddhism in the last video. And in this one, we're going to cover in the first video, we covered who the Buddha is and kind of a short history of his life and how he became the awakened one, which is what Buddha means. And in this one, we're going to talk about those beliefs that he came up with and practices that lead to enlightenment for others. So what is Buddhism? The Buddha's teachings on how to be free from suffering and reincarnation, which is in and of itself suffering, because as he's famous for saying, life is suffering. It's actually the word, that sounds dismal, okay, admittedly. But the word dukkha, even though it's translated in English to suffering most commonly, is really more akin to dissatisfaction. So you might remember from the last video, he dawned on this idea that suffering comes from desire, selfish desire, evil desires, dissatisfaction with life, what you have in life, and what you have these aspirations to excel in certain areas of life, and those expectations aren't met, and then you experience suffering. All of it is dukkha, dukkha, dukkha. Okay, so life is dukkha. Kyle's laughing. He said dukkha. So dukkha is more like dissatisfaction. And he discovers there that this can be overcome. If you accept the Four Noble Truths, as they're called, and then practice the Eightfold Path, you will accomplish balance, or the middle way, and you will find happiness, and suffering can be eliminated from life. And if you go all the way to full enlightenment, nirvana, which is not a place, but rather a state of being, if you reach nirvana, you will not only escape the suffering of this life, you will escape the suffering, the inevitable suffering of endless reincarnations. So let's look at the Four Noble Truths first. These are just statements about reality and the need to accept that reality for what it is. The first one, life is dukkha. Life is dissatisfaction. Life is suffering. The second one, dukkha, comes from desires. The third, there can be an end to dukkha. And the fourth, the end comes through the Eightfold Path. So what then is the Eightfold Path? Well, we can begin by talking about the first of, let's talk about the symbol. The symbol, a common symbol in Buddhism, there are many, but a very common one is this. It looks like a wheel on an old pirate ship, to me, and it is a wheel, and it has 8 spokes, and the 8 spokes represent the Eightfold Path, the Noble Eightfold Path, and the path begins with the section of the wheel that pertains to wisdom. So the first spoke is right view. And this is accepting the Four Noble Truths. It's seeing reality for what it is. It's that simple. The second one also belongs to the section of the wheel for wisdom, and that is right intentions. So you have right view, you're accepting reality for what it is, and then you have right intentions, which is the intentions of thinking positively, basically. So you have the intention to be a positive being. Then you move into a section of the wheel that is pertaining to ethics. So at the beginning of the ethics part of the wheel is right speech. Again, another spoke in the wheel. Buddhists insist that words have power. You've heard other people say this. It's not just Buddhists that believe it. Words have power, and so be careful with your words. Be intentional with your words. Choose them and use them wisely with yourself. Super important part of it, because most of us are careful with how we use our words with each other. Most of us. But we're not nearly as careful about the words that we use for ourselves in the dialogue that we have with ourselves. And they will stress that this is every bit, if not more important, than being careful with your words with others. The next spoke in the ethics part of the wheel is right action. And this is, again, nothing complex about this, but it's not easy. So it's simple, but it's not easy to actually do. Right action basically is just fostering love for everything. Compassion and love. You're fostering compassion and love for everything. And then the last spoke in the ethics part of the wheel is right livelihood. Because of your right action, fostering love for all things, you avoid work that exploits other living things. Hamisa is also something practiced in Jainism, which is to do no harm, basically. You never intentionally harm other things. And so right livelihood, how you earn a living for getting on in life, then should be something that does not exploit other people, nor should it exploit other animals. So a great number of Buddhists are actually vegetarians. Could ask the question, well, what about exploiting plants? They're living things too, but I haven't heard any answers for that. Now we're moving into the concentration part of the wheel, and there are 3 spokes for that as well. The first one we'll look at is right effort. Right effort to working for making the effort to push out negative thoughts, and the intentional effort to forge positive thoughts. You had the intention over here in wisdom, but intent is not action in and of itself. So this is the action part of it. You are developing skills to keep your mind on what is, as St. Paul put it in the Christian tradition, what is excellent, praiseworthy, lovely, admirable, anything Paul says that that is worthy of your respect. Fix your mind on these things. Same principle here. You have to be intentional about it and then act on those intentions. And Buddhism does a really great job, a better job than any of the traditions I've looked at of prescribing practices that help you with this. The most popular one is mindfulness. Many have heard of that in the West. So this next spoke, though, is right concentration. And this is the work of training the mind not to wander. Because if you can train the mind to be laser focused on your right efforts, then you'll be able to nip negativity in the bud, so to speak. So as soon as any of that negative stuff comes up, if you have worked at right concentration, then that means that you are aware. You're increasingly aware of, like you would be of a fly coming to land on your food. You can just go and bat it away before it ever gets there. So this is right concentration. And then right mindfulness is the last of the spokes. And this is the effort put into living in the present, in the now, you may have heard it said. Living in the now and doing so without judgment. That means you're not considering what's happening now as good or bad. You're not judging it. You're just aware of it. And that this is a skill. This is something that you can develop. This is something that I've actually practiced, and I've seen it improve over the years, where you become more aware and more accepting of your nows as you experience them, and enjoy them. So life simply becomes more enjoyable because it's not about good or bad. It's not about satisfying those kind of self-centered desires or expectations. It's just being aware of what is occurring in the moment and appreciating the reality of that moment. It's kind of hard to describe unless, so the recommendation is just do it. Become more mindful. Well, what does that mean? It means just train yourself to be more aware of what's going on in the moment. If a bug crawls across your windshield, you can be aware of that. And as you become more aware of it, I mean, this sounds like a dumb example, but I'm just using it because I've experienced this, okay? So a bug's crawling across my windshield. It was on the inside. I'm looking at this bug, and my initial reaction was to smash it. It's in my way. Instead, as I saw that thought coming, I batted the thought away instead of the little bug. And then I just became aware of the bug there. And that's when I had the accident. Just kidding. I wasn't so aware that I couldn't drive, okay? But the little bug's crawling across the windshield, and I thought, my God, that thing is freaking amazing. And I thought about all of the beauty in its complexity. That thing, that little tiny, tiny bug, it's like one of those no-see-ums almost. Probably because I had some old McDonald's in the car or something like that. So it's crawling across the windshield, and I'm like, that thing is so wildly complex. It even has its own little consciousness. And so my thoughts just went around that moment, contemplating that bug. And then I thought about how nice the air conditioning was in the car and so on and so forth. And I had a happy moment. I had several happy moments just by doing that. And so I highly recommend mindfulness as a practice. If the word mindfulness or meditation bothers you, then just call it prayer. It's basically the same thing in the Christian tradition. Highly recommend it. So those are the spokes of the Eightfold Path. You can go into much greater detail about each one of those spokes if you want to, and dig out a lot of wisdom from it. There are in Buddhism, you know how in Christianity we have many, many, many different denominations, right? And we bewail that because of Jesus' desire to see us unified. But the same thing is true in all religions, and Buddhism is no exception. In Buddhism, there are two major camps, if you will, the Theravada and the Mahayana. The Theravada is the oldest sect of Buddhism, or it's more than a sect because it has sects within it. But anyway, it's the oldest tradition and probably adheres to the more historic version of Buddhism. I don't mean that in a good or bad way. It's just reality. So the word Theravada is the elders, is basically what it means. And so it's hearkening back to the, I think, 100 disciples that the Buddha originally sent out, after, given that he was going to die. And they supposedly wrote down his sayings in the Pali text. It's called the Pali text or the Pali canon because it is the standard of texts that are written in the ancient language of Pali. But then, starting at about 100 years after that period, you have Buddhism, because it spread into all these different regions and encountered their regional traditions and religious beliefs. It begins to take on some of those things. And so you see gods and demigods coming into the picture and devotion to some of them for certain reasons. and a lot of new texts come on the scene, just oodles and oodles of new texts and gods. And central to Mahayana belief are these characters, these beings known as bodhisattvas. And the bodhisattva is interesting to me as a Christian, as a theologian, because they are the part of Buddhism that I guess reflect the sacrificial qualities of Jesus the Messiah. Because the bodhisattva is the being who reaches full enlightenment, but then refuses to enter into nirvana for the sake of others, so that they can be an influence on the progression of others. Which you have to understand from the Buddhist mindset, that's an ultimate sacrifice. Because life and death, well, I mean, everybody lives and dies and then lives again and dies and lives again and dies. And so whatever. But to give up nirvana, the freedom from that endless cycle, so that you remain in the cycle with this heightened enlightenment in order to help others reach nirvana. It's awesome. So I'm going to end this section here with some comparative analysis, if you will. This is just because of my own interest, and this is really the only original stuff that I brought to this. Again, go watch Cogito. It's a much funnier version of what I just taught you. So when you look at, I said earlier, maybe in the first video, that the similarities between Christianity, which is the tradition I know best, the similarities that I ran into as I studied other religions were really freaking inspiring to me. Because these similarities are important to me because they speak to a universal wisdom that pervades this reality and the consciousness of humanity. Wisdom that transcends all of the cultural differences of different cultural groups and different beliefs. Buddhism is not the same as Christianity, but in my opinion, I agree with Father Richard Rohr that they are very complementary to one another. I'll let him explain that in his video, which is a short thing that I'll link for you. So when we look at the teachings of the Buddha and the teachings of the Christ, people are curious. I was curious. Well, what are the similarities? There are many more than what I'm going to share here, but here are a few. The Buddha says, if you do not tend to one another, then who is there to tend to you? Whoever would tend me, he should tend the sick. That can also be translated, as I understand it. Whoever would tend me would be tending the sick. That's interesting because Jesus says, truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And just as you would do for the least of these, you have done it to me. He also, Jesus says, do to others as you would have them do to you, the golden rule. Well, does Buddhism have a golden rule? Yes. The Buddha said something very similar. He said, do not do to others what you don't want them doing to you. Consider rather others as yourself. Cool. The Buddha said, the fault of others is easily perceived, but the faults of oneself, very difficult to perceive. And so you should set yourself to the task of understanding yourself. Jesus said something very similar. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the board in your own eye? So there are many, many more parallel teachings that you can find between the Buddha, his teachings, and and the Christ, his teachings. So I will put a link in here for Richard Rohr's video where he talks about the way that Buddhism can actually, if you're a Christian, it can make you a better Christ follower. So this has been a quick synopsis, if you will, summary of what Buddhism is, its core teachings. There are many, many sects of Buddhism that vary greatly from one another in worship practices and in some doctrine. But what I've given you are the things that hold them all in the camp of Buddhism. Okay? So I appreciate you watching, and I'll look for you in the next one.